to us because Shopify is an entire company created around this concept. Like I mean, I grew up in the 80s and 90s, where the premise of the internet was massive decentralization of opportunity, right? Where when we first got the internet, that was the first time you could put something, like could put up a website and would be able to communicate with people you never met or don't have a phone number for outside of your hometown, which was meaningful because it was in a small town. Shopify is sort of like, let's bring that internet forward. Let's build a business model which aligns our interests with that of everyone on the platform, and where we can, because of the marginal cost of software and so on, like through all these millions of businesses that are succeeding now at this scale, we can reinvest all of this money, and we can build the things that will make a meaningful difference again to the success of everyone who's using us, and it creates this virtuous cycle, which is awesome. Which is a different virtuous cycle than if your objective would be to try to capture most of the profits of a particular market. And I actually don't know which one of those is going to succeed. I hope there's room for both of the approaches. It doesn't actually I don't actually think about this in terms of winning so much because it's not, they can both be true at the same time. But I think it behooves us all to cheer for the small businesses, because something like 80% of our people work for small businesses. Like we always like ignore them. Like, I mean, people tend to invoke entrepreneurs and SMBs, but sort of in the very abstract, not in the concrete. Concretely, most of the people are employed by them. we kind of need them for the viability of all of our economies. So I think it's great when people build business models where they open up markets to as many other people to succeed as possible. I think the internet should yield more of that.
Yeah, one thing also that I think is so important that Tobi mentioned is there's also this idea that to be successful, quote unquote, as an entrepreneur, you have to be the next Gymshark or Allbirds. But remember that for so many people, for every 26 seconds, there's a real stat, 26 seconds, a new entrepreneur gets their first sale on Shopify. And for many of those entrepreneurs, their definition of success is also not necessarily being the next Gymshark, although they may want to be. It may just be putting food on the table. It may just be the ability to not work at that job they absolutely hate. It may be the ability just to put their daughter into ballet lessons or the kids into some sort of sport that they otherwise wouldn't be able to afford. And so that as a concept, I think gets lost a little bit in the hype of some of these big DTC brands, which are amazing. The other thing that's worthwhile pointing out is Tobi talked about the supply side of entrepreneurship, that there are more people starting businesses. And Josh, your point around capital being the unfair advantage that some big companies had previously, to which they were able to build the leaders in e-commerce. One thing also to understand is there has been a shift on the demand side. We saw during Black Friday, Cyber Monday, so the 4-day weekend in November, we saw about $5.1 billion transacted on Shopify in 4 days. That's effectively a proxy for independent businesses. So that means that, I mean, and whatever the total GMV was across all of e-commerce, it was in the neighborhood of $20 to $25 billion in the US. So, but 5.1 globally went through Shopify. The reason that's important is because that means that consumers, more than ever before, are now voting with their wallets to buy whenever possible from independent brands and retailers, that they would prefer to buy from those brands and retailers because they want them to exist in the world. And I think we as consumers, we all love to talk about independent brands and our local, the local brands in our communities. But actually that is now happening in a way that I don't think we've ever seen before. And I don't think that's going away.
Yeah, I love that concept that of being sort of that no matter where you are, that you can be a local business, that it's become less about, in my opinion, sort of the geography. It's more about just finding the like niche or subculture that you love to support. Yeah, but I want to bring it back to a point that Tobi talked about earlier, which was to get real for a second. Entrepreneurship is super difficult. And I think a lot of times, especially on Clubhouse, you hear nothing but like these moguls who succeeded or these brands that are raising all this money or have these crazy sales. And you can start to think that like, oh, it's supposed to be easy or everybody wins, or even worse, that like if you're not winning, that there's something wrong with you, that it's like you're the anomaly, not those success stories. And how do you talk to entrepreneurs about like having that grit and understanding that that it's okay to fail, and like instilling that lesson. I mean, that's such a cool story that one of your biggest shops was the 6th shop started by Emergent, that they had 5 big failures first. And what can entrepreneurs maybe learn from both their own failures, but also how can they be sort of resilient to that culture that makes them feel like they have to be succeeding all the time?
It's sort of like the entrepreneurs, I don't know, there's like the entrepreneur's credo almost, that you talk about your wins, not your losses, which actually I don't think serves the greater community very, very well. One of the things that I think is actually much better is in these communities, whether it's on any social media platform or it's on Clubhouse, where people are actually talking about, hey, we actually built 5 stores before we ended up building the major store, the major success. I think that's really, really healthy. And actually, I think one of the things that we sometimes forget, and certainly, Tobi and I try to do this as much as possible, is that, people now look at Shopify as being, a large publicly traded company. But remember, the road to get here was really tough. There were some weeks and some months and some years where we weren't sure where this was going. We weren't sure whether or not we were going to be successful. And so I think one of the things, and I know there's like 5,000 people listening right now, which is amazing. Anyone who's in this room that has either an audience or has a soapbox or has a platform to share their stories, please share not just the successful stories, but also share the stories of sleepless nights, and share the stories of, and again, not to glamorize it or to make it seem macho, but rather because I think people need to know that before you become Gymshark, you have to have 3, you may have 3 failures before you get there. And that's, I mean, I was talking to Joey from Allbirds this last week at Shopify. We brought him on for a town hall, and he was talking about all the jobs he had before him and Tim created Allbirds. And what's fascinating was, in every one of those jobs, he took something from it, whether it was a manufacturing process, whether it was an understanding of how cross-border tax compliance operates, whether it's how he can open source the actual rubber that's built into the bottom of every Allbirds. He took a little piece of insight from each of those jobs. So even though none of those jobs into themselves was a huge success, it allowed him and Tim to build what is now one of the most important direct-to-consumer brands on the planet. And I think that's how we like. I think we need to not only share those stories, but we also should call out other people when we see them just glamorizing all of it. And certainly, the majority of the business that I've started have been failures, and that's okay because I tried to take something from it. But I think it's inauthentic to pretend that's not the case.
Tobi, what do you think?
I mean, I think that's exactly right. I tried a ton of things before, and which didn't work. And in fact, so much of what Shopify attempted to do also failed. I mean, we have internal language around this. We call it the successful discovery of things that did not work instead of failure, because it really is building something is very personal, and you are on this infinite journey, right? And this is like, you're not really trying to like make the next quarter or so. I should probably not say this as a public company CEO, but like
as the man who has to actually deliver earnings reports.
Right. But like I think I think the world has a sense for trying to explain everything that's going on in very sort of finite game language, like this is how to win something. This is how the score is kept. Here are the rules, and here are the various players. In reality, I mean, entrepreneurship is for infinite. It's the ultimate infinite journey, right? Where you the goal is not to win. The goal is to see how deep a rabbit hole goes. I think what you will find, especially if you are so lucky to keep the infinite journey going, especially keeping it going for a while, where you can at some point have a wonderful experience of turning around and just sort of looking like how it all kind of transpired. I think what you will find in this looking back and connecting the dots is it didn't end up being any of the things that you thought were important. Like the way all the dots connected is this very indirect, meandering story over where you had to go on all these what seemingly side quests just to like either get some information or just fail utterly, and you managed to keep going the things you learned. And to me, it's just a whole lot more honest way to think about it. I mean, yeah, I'm like incredibly lucky with Shopify success, and I want to be clear, like luck is a huge component of this, and obviously it comes in a lot of different forms, like timing and people luck, especially. But it's the. Go ahead.
I was just going to say my favorite Tobiism actually came up fairly early in the conversation, which is, and this was really valuable to me, that look at failure not as a failure, but as the successful discovery of something that did not work. I mean, that should be the entrepreneur's credo, I think, because that tells you so much about what is required to be an entrepreneur and to build businesses, whether they're successful or not. And that's one thing that, you know, Tobi really has instilled certainly on me personally. And I love the way that is. I love the way that's put.
That's beautiful. And I think that what's fascinating about this is that vulnerability, that willingness to be open with your audience, with your customers, and especially with like your friends and partner network, you know, people who you don't have to always be crushing it in front of. I think that there's actually a resurgence in the opportunity for marketing here. You know, we saw this change in the dominant aesthetic on Instagram. You know, a few years ago, it was all about being like the most manicured, the most well posed, you know, everything being perfect. And increasingly, your fans got tired of it. They just felt like this is processed, this isn't real, this is what the like traditional celebrity it is not the kind of personas I want to identify with and I can actually relate to. And increasingly, you saw this rise of a new aesthetic, which was much more candid, much more off the cuff, much more real life, and showing kind of your flaws and exposing that, because influencers realize that like that's what makes them seem real and relatable and like the person you want to have a beer with. You know, as the classic, like, how do you get elected president? You be the person everyone wants to have a beer with. And I think a lot more brands could adopt that concept that, you know, if most of the people in your audience might be failing, then maybe you should talk about failing too, because it's something you have in common, and it can really drive that sense of like emotional resonance and connection. You know, have you seen that like people have actually had success from talking about that vulnerability, beyond it obviously being a great societal good to just talk about your vulnerabilities, especially if you have had success, especially if you have that kind of soapbox?
I think you're exactly right. And I think that's a really good point. Like I mean, I'm now super optimistic just from what you said, because like I would love for planet Earth to get tired of fake stuff, right? Like it's. I mean, my experience when I was an apprentice at like a really big German company. This doesn't sound related, but I won't dwell too long on it. But like one thing which really shocked me about at least corporate life in the 90s in Germany was just like the personas, right? Like it's like everyone like dressed up and like differently than they would in suit and tie, and in German you end up using like a formal form with everyone, and they didn't even allow you to use the familiar form. Luckily, English doesn't have that problem, and like everyone basically was pretending to be the same like 60-year-old white-haired lawyer, no matter like gender, creed, or background, right? And I think that's, I think there's been a lot of this kind of sanitization, posturing. I think there's lots of reasons. I think we've even seen this with like even with products, we've seen it. I think the only products that could ever make it to market were the ones that were least objectionable, because all the products were gate kept by a few merchandisers at very large big box stores. And so like nothing out of the ordinary could make it through. And I think the same thing has been true about, you know, people who are quote unquote professional. Like, or at least in the sense that I'm talking about, which I know is not a universal thing, but something I observed. And I think there's there's, you know, I would love it to be true that just more realness comes back. This uncanny valley of perfection has been just, I think, exhausting. I don't know what the point is. I think it's perfectly good to talk about the challenges. Like when I started Shopify, I thought we were going to be dead tomorrow, basically every day. But I also thought maybe we're going to be unstoppable if I just get this thing done. And sometimes I was a week in one state and a week in another state, and it just oscillated back and forth. That's still going on. Like maybe the oscillation has increased in speed now at the scale. Sometimes it's like before breakfast, it goes both ways. But there's no difference. It's a very raw experience. Entrepreneurship is super, super hard. Being a leader of any kind is super hard. Being a leader during times of COVID is crushing as a responsibility. And so I think that's perfectly good to give people a view into this. I don't necessarily would say like that's a recommendation to people, because it probably works slightly less well than presenting the polished, we've got everything figured out view. But I don't think that should be our style. It's sort of be the change you seek is a rather important sentence to me.
And I think there's a direct connection. Authentic brands and the ones that we've seen do really well, the people behind the brands that just brought themselves. There's a lot of talk, of course, around like things like Kylie Cosmetics or Jeffree Star. One of the things that I think that changed in terms of like these celebrities or influencers building real brands on Shopify or anywhere for that matter, is that they brought an authenticity that traditionally you hadn't seen before. You'd see, some random, famously Brad Pitt had a toothbrush in the 80s that he was endorsing, that there was no connection to it. But the reason that Jeffree Star has built one of the greatest cosmetic brands on the planet is because Jeffree started doing makeup tutorials on YouTube and then realized that he actually can go ahead and create his own makeup, and he can do, he can actually sell those to the audience of people. Everything about the Jeffree Star brand or even the Kylie brand is really authentic. And when you compare that or juxtapose that to something like Sephora, the reason you have a different connection to it is because one provides this sort of perfect model, unapproachable version of a brand. And say what you want about Kylie, whether or not she had some assistance because of her fame or not, she really did create a brand that is an extension of her. And Jeffree certainly did the same thing as well. And so I think it's not only important just from a society perspective to have more honesty about who you are and your failures, and where vulnerability is more of a strength than it is a weakness, but actually it's also really, really good business.
To that end, we talked a little bit about what it's like for a founder trying to go through that, like those vulnerability moments and deal with those challenges. But what do you tell your teammates, especially if somebody, when you're a founder talking to people who aren't the founders, who don't have, as much of the reward to reap if things do succeed, but basically share in a lot of the failure if things don't go so well? How do what do you find works for talking to team members? You guys have run your own businesses now with Shopify, going through its own ups and downs. How can you sort of keep morale high, especially amongst members who don't have, maybe as much like equity in the game, but have plenty of skin?
One of the things about Shopify that I think people are beginning to understand a little bit, because frankly, we're talking a bit more about it, is a vast majority of the people that work at Shopify are founders and entrepreneurs themselves. I see people like, Farhan and a bunch of Frankie, and it's just a bunch of people on this call right now that work at Shopify. That are listening to us right now. So Shopify is a collection of people who otherwise would be running their own business, in many cases very successfully. And we just decided to throw in together because we think we can have a larger impact. So that idea that that we have founders coming to work at Shopify who then treat Shopify as if it's their own company, that feel this inherent ownership of it, not just with equity, but a real emotional connection to this idea that, the world is better off with more entrepreneurs, and we feel this responsibility to create more entrepreneurs and to sort of quote unquote arm these rebels, because otherwise the world is all boring and we're all going to be buying from marketplaces and department stores all day, and that's not interesting. However, once you come to Shopify, one of the things I think that becomes really apparent is this idea of requalifying every year. And Tobi and I talk about this even for ourselves, certainly for me, and Tobi says this all the time, that he has to requalify every year to ensure that every year he is still the best candidate to be the CEO of Shopify. And that weight, that onus is heavy. But when you're doing with a group of people who deeply inspire you, who also deeply want to requalify with this incredible growth mindset, unlike any other environment that I've ever encountered, I think you end up with this incredible place where people can stay for a very long time. And you know, Josh, you've covered Silicon Valley and technology companies for as long as I've known you with TechCrunch. One of the things that you and I have talked about, actually we had a conversation years ago at Whistler, I think at some tech conference, you talked about that you felt the average tenure at Shopify was just longer than most other companies. And that's correct. We do have people that stay with us for a very, very long time. And what that allows a lot of people to do is for them to keep requalifying, but also to have have 10 years worth of career development every single year. And we wouldn't have that Fusion brand.
I think people come to Shopify for the people, but stay for the mission, right? Like this is one of the most incredible advantages that that Shopify just has. Like the thing we're doing is really, really important. Like I think this is easier to talk about now than it was because after COVID, because it just was a little bit more opaque. But like the externalities of Shopify's success are more entrepreneurship happening in the world, right? Like it's all kind of so good. And I think that's really, really easy to fall in love with, like, because I mean, certainly like the people, like lots of people at Shopify did very, very well, and like are not showing up for the paychecks, right? Like they are interested in working on something that they are going to be incredibly proud of at the end of their career, potentially not just the particular work, but the downstream effects that the work had. This sort of design a company and its business models with all the externalities, with an awareness of all the externalities, is something that I think in general most industries don't do well enough. So you know, like again, it is like if you look at just retail is a huge opportunity. Like it's like what is $2 trillion per digital retail. It's probably going to be $4 trillion or something. It's like the numbers are, I don't even know how to write so many zeros. I'd get bored and distracted before I'm done. So it's like, this is an enormous opportunity. Usually when you have a space, then people look at there and it's like, again, they say, cool, that is an amazing space. How am I going to like get most of that? Like that's really what you build a company around in a normal sense. And let me just say, like, I think that's an easier company to build. Like, it's much easier to accrue the benefits of a very valuable field to yourself. We are building a business model and a company around sharing the opportunity instead of using it for ourselves. I mean, don't get me wrong, Shopify is a very good business, especially now due to the scale of the market itself. But that's harder to do. That's a harder thing to do. Like that's you're signing up for significantly harder challenges if that's the thing you're engaged at. And so that's a bit of a subtle point. And it usually takes people probably like a year or two working at Shopify until it somehow clicks that this nourishes like more parts of the interests than just being surrounded by caring, hardworking, and smart and impressive people, which is obviously incredible if you can pull it off. But like, so I think this is why tenure is high. This is why care is high. This is why, like, I think there's a lot of alignedness. And again, when we get to work with incredible merchants, incredible entrepreneurs, again, such an like incredibly inspiring people, like really every direction you look, and that's an amazing situation.
So you talked a little bit earlier about like making people feel like they're founders, like that they're part owners in a business, regardless of sort of the equity stake. And so I wanted to ask, you know, how do you how do you sort of deputize people to be leadership? Because I think you guys have done an incredible job of building this sort of wider bench. It's not just you, Tobi. It's Harley and the rest of the co-founders and the team that feel like they're the leaders of Shopify. It's not like a single point of failure. And I think that that's so important for a lot of brands, because there's so many challenges, so many things you have to tackle, especially if you're running your own shop. Like you're juggling a million things. But it can be natural to sort of like hoard power and control over something because it's your baby. You don't want to give up, and you don't want somebody else to suddenly make a decision that could move it in the wrong direction. But by not giving up any of that power, by like keeping an iron grip on everything, you're just letting actually a lot slip through your fingers. And so how have you thought about, Tobi, like deputizing other figures in the business to feel like they're part owners? And what would you say for advice for e-commerce leaders out there who maybe are like a sole founder or CEO to help make sure that there are other people in their business that they trust, that they can rely on, and that they're open to delegating some of that power and responsibility to, so that they can be a stronger team together?
I mean, this is probably the hardest question to answer in the entire world of business. I actually don't think there is a formula to do it, and I also wouldn't say that I have a particular line on the truth on this particular matter. Whenever I'm thinking about my failures, it's usually the failures around doing this as better. I guess I have a very strong sense that real progress comes from just alignment. Sorry, I'm losing my voice right now. I guess the point, what you want to do is, again, after if you can pull it off, that people fall in love with the same problem and the same mission, then what you need is context. Like there's a couple of things we talk very casually around Shopify about. Chesterton's fence is a mental model that is worth reading up on, right? Because we built this company, and we built it in a hurry sometimes, and so some of the parts we built were just put up in a hurry because we needed to put up something, and some parts we very, very carefully considered. And when especially new leaders come along, it's really important for them to understand which walls of the building they can take the sledgehammer to, and then which parts they need to be careful about, right? And so anyway, the point is, there's a broader mission, and that's quite clear. There's a role underneath this about like an area, and that needs to be clear. And this is the way I think everyone wants to know, how can I make my work best to the benefit of the collective? And as long as you spend the time with everyone to just explain, here's like the direction, here's looking at the plans, like making sure, like agree that this is the right way. I mean, you build the trust battery, and once the battery is fully charged, you don't need to do that anymore. And I think this is where so much of the potential speed in companies like this comes from.
We talk a lot about the trust battery. It's an interesting analogy or a metaphor to use, because what tends to happen is most people come into the company and they're, we're at 50% trust battery when you come in, and the more you deliver on time, you do what you say, you do the things that you said you would do, trust battery goes up. And once you get to that point where there is really high trust, whether it's 100% or it's 99%, somewhere in that range, you get autonomy. And that's where actually everything you loved about being a founder of your own thing, you can actually do at Shopify as well. And the reverse is true, of course, too. But by not doing what you say you're going to do, by failing to live up to your expectations and what you've committed to, eventually the battery does get to a point where it may not be able to be recharged like an old cell phone battery. And at that point, it just, that's when it's better to sort of part ways. But remember, one of the things that is so unique about Shopify, and many of you that are listening now, it's the same in your own business too. It is amazing to do something very challenging, something very difficult with people you deeply respect. And that is amazing. And that's, a lot of people have that with their jobs. But the added benefit to the mission of Shopify is that we think that what we're doing, the actual mission of the company, helping more people discover and get deep into entrepreneurship, that connects, like the Venn diagram of a lot of our personal interests and the company's mission. There is massive overlap. And it's not to say that other technology companies don't have that, but if I was selling, I don't know, accounting software, it'd be cool, but I wouldn't feel like, wait a second, we are actually arming the rebels. We are creating an entire, an entire mission around this idea that anyone can go ahead and create financial independence. Anyone can find their own identity and share it with the world. That also is a very valuable thing to have, the thing you are working on and the thing you personally care about, to have so much overlap on those two items.
Yeah, I love that phrase of the idea that how just that sense of like charging the battery and getting yourself to autonomy, but also the concept of like get people to fall in love with the same problem as you. I think that alignment is so important. And it reminds me of this quote that Jeff Marks told me. Jeff Marks is one of the writers of Avenue Q and the Book of Mormon, the incredibly popular musicals. And when he was working with his partner, he said that they would frequently come to a point where they would disagree about like how a scene should go or the lyrics to a song. And the easy decision to do was like to say, well, Jeff says it should be this way and his partner says it should be this way. And so the only options are it's either his way, the other guy's way, or it's a compromise in the middle. And Jeff told me what I thought was one of the most insightful things that he'd ever told me was that there is a secret missing fourth option. And that's where you say, if it's not aligned with both of us, it's not good enough. And you just go back to the drawing board and write a whole new scene, a whole new song that you both are so in love with that you're both going to promote it with your full, like your full heart and energy. Because if you start to divert from that alignment, if you start to have little pieces of a bigger project where you say like, well, that wasn't my decision, and you can kind of like opt out of the responsibility and accountability for them, you quickly opt out of accountability for the entire project and you don't put your heart behind actually making it a success. And I think like that concept of how you come to alignment with your partner is so important. And Tobi, maybe you could tell us, like, have you guys had a decision maybe between you and Harley where you guys have come to that sort of like butting heads about which direction you should go in, and how did you guys resolve that decision and find that path forward where everyone was aligned?
And by the way, Josh, I think I hope everyone realized this was the soundbite that everyone should have tuned in for, because this is ridiculously good advice that you just shared. It absolutely echoes everything I've seen in my career. I would actually put in, like, if I had more time, I would probably put an impassionate plea for also taking the compromise option off the table, because that is, like, most of the products in the world are like extremely mediocre, right? The reason is everyone ending up settling for hybrid solutions that end up being compromises, and compromises, by the way, just importantly, will never end up with real strengths, because the thing that people disagree about is usually the edginess of something. So like a compromise always like never resembles the spikiness of a really nifty idea. It always ends up resembling some kind of river stone that got ground up over time and is now like perfectly agreeable. So you really like do it one way, the other way, or generate new options. And I think that's a sentence we have a lot. Like, we get in a lot of meetings and there's disagreement. We just say, hey, let's find new options. Like, maybe we don't need to make a decision within the confines of the boundaries in which we fought to make a choice in. Maybe if we step one step out of this particular box and play with boundaries a bit, we can actually circumnavigate the entire thing, right? Like, that's like Shopify shipped with, what is it, supporting, I mean, initially 10 payment gateways, and then like, I think we went up to 80. At some point we realized we should just ship with payments. Like no one can, like, websites should just be able to accept money, and then that's how we did it. And hopefully we'll be able to deliver something around like this for the world of shipping again. Like, if you step out of the confines in which you're trying to make a choice, you often see a better play, right? And that's important. I mean, I can, nothing terribly good example of this other than just, I can confirm that Harley and I have plenty of disagreements, and I mean, we've never taken something to the vote, have we? Like, it's more like at some point, just there's an overwhelming obviousness to some approach or one way to go, and then we go with that.
Yeah, but it seems like you weren't able to convince him to take a profile picture with a better hat.
I think it's pretty. I think that's.
I like my hat.
Yeah.
Actually, Tobi, as you know, is a famous hat wearer, so I felt that I had to step it up a little bit. But it's one of the things also, Josh, I think that is interesting on that point as well is this idea that the idea of compromise, for example, like Tobi's example of Shopify. We had this thing called Active Merchant, which was our open source payment gateway library, which had, again, I think it was actually 95 payment gateways we had. And then this idea that adding another 5 payment gateways is probably the local maxima version of what we should be doing. But actually, what if payments just came stock inside of Shopify? That is a conversation that we constantly think of. How do we actually forget what the next step is in this on this particular amount? And if you sort of zoom out and say, what do entrepreneurs need? What does small business need? They don't need to wait 48 hours to get a merchant account approved or provision a merchant account. They don't need to send their passport, fax their passport to some bank in Utah. What they need is they need to be able to accept payments right away. And more, I think what we're trying to do is that just to continue to reduce any barrier to success that exists. And something that came up earlier, which we sort of jumped over quickly, is right now, if you were to think about Shopify as a retailer, we're not a retailer, of course, but if you were to pretend for a second that Shopify was a single retailer, we would be the second largest online retailer in America. Amazon's checkout would be the largest. The second would be Shopify's.
That's pretty incredible how far this has come so quickly. So I want to ask another question, which is a little bit more forward-facing. We talked a lot about the vulnerability of entrepreneurs, and some incredible insights so far. You guys talked about it's hard to build an e-commerce brand, but the cost of failure is about as close to zero as we've ever been, and that people are looking for this alternative career path. That that this is the moment that Shopify was created for, and that that as many people should be able to participate in the internet as possible. That you want to make your own game, and that especially when you have role models of people who've shown you what you can do with entrepreneurship in your life, you realize how malleable the world really is. Getting to those first 1,000 true fans matters more than massive distribution, and that right now this is the moment, because small business formation is growing for the first time in a century. And I really love you guys talk about that entrepreneurship is working 100 hours for yourself so you don't have to work 40 hours for somebody else, and that sometimes failing makes you better at winning. And you talked about how some of the Shopify's biggest sellers actually had 5 failed shops first before they find the one that really worked. And that even though entrepreneurship is really hard and we should never glorify it, that if you can get people aligned with the dream and the problem that you're trying to solve, they're going to feel that sense of autonomy, and you're going to be able to trust them enough to sort of act as your second hand, and that's when you can really start to get a lot more done. And I do hope, and like Tobi said, that the planet Earth starts to get a little bit more tired of fakeness, and that you need to really be able to charge your battery with trust and do what you say, so that people are willing to give you that autonomy, and that compromise can lead to mediocrity. That quote you said, Tobi, of a compromise is a river stone ground down over time to something perfectly agreeable, has no teeth anymore. It's you're never going to be able to sink into a market or really connect to somebody if there's no edge to it. But with those are some of the amazing points that you guys shared so far. But so before we finish up, I want to ask, what are some trends or opportunities that you see for e-commerce entrepreneurs out there, or any entrepreneur, to seize on? Maybe that's new platforms that they should be jumping on, new forms of experimentation, we talked a little bit about being more vulnerable in public, or just writing in public, or being more forceful about talking to your community and your network about having them help you get off the ground. Maybe do you have any of those little pieces of advice about how to adapt to the future of e-commerce and entrepreneurship?
I think one thing that most people assume about Tobi and I, because of the Shopify connection, of course, is that we think that the future of retail or commerce is online only. And actually, we don't think that. We actually think the future of retail, the future of commerce is everywhere. It's wherever consumers want to buy. And one of the reasons you're seeing us announce things with TikTok or with Walmart or with Instagram is that we think that the modern day town squares are online and they're offline and they're actual town squares, but they're also in places like Clubhouse. And so part of what we're trying to accomplish is that when you come to Shopify, maybe you just want to sell initially online, but very quickly you may want to activate a physical channel, or you want to sell on some other marketplace, or you want to sell across social media. The idea should be that that you as an entrepreneur, as a merchant, need to sell wherever your consumers are. And I think activating new channels. I was in a Clubhouse room a couple weeks ago and was just doing a Q&A about entrepreneurship, and someone basically just pitched me their company. It was a tea company, and she's like, hey, just come. This is not a question. This is just a pitch. And actually, I started buying tea from this person's company. She now has a way that if she has a way to engage a community in a place like Clubhouse, where most other tea companies are not even thinking about, that is amazing. And so I don't actually think that there is one way to do this. I think that there is anyone that's on here right now that is thinking about starting a business. First of all, figure out what you already do, what you already love, a gift that you already have. If you write a blog about soccer, maybe you should start selling soccer products to those people that are already engaged with you around that concept. But this idea that it's so precious and you have to create a business plan, I think that is ridiculous. I actually think that it is the best time ever. Again, it's not easy, and it certainly is not. It certainly is not going to happen automatically to be successful. But there is no better time for entrepreneurship than right now, because of the tools and the access to a global consumer base. And I just want to also say, for those that are on the consumer side, for everyone listening, if you want more of these brands to exist, and I certainly do, we need to make sure that we buy from these independent brands. On the other side of this pandemic, if we want our communities and our cities to be interesting and to have character and have culture, we need to make sure these businesses exist. And so when you buy from these independent brands and these merchants and these entrepreneurs, you are actually voting that they need to exist in the world. And so this is just a call out to everyone listening. Please, support independent business, support local shops and merchants. This is so important. So I'm not sure I'm answering your question, but I couldn't miss the opportunity to give a shout out to all the entrepreneurs and businesses.
I can't add anything to that. I think you close the loop perfectly here. It's again, there's Shopify is many things right now. It's growing a lot, but it fundamentally represents a worldview that it's super important to enable people reaching for independence. Retail is only one area of that, which is the one we focus on. Other companies are also in this arena, and we cheer for them as well. And I think that's honestly the key thing that explains the company best, and we'll try to make it simpler and simpler and simpler to build these businesses. And maybe one plug is there's going to be a Cambrian explosion of new channels coming that are going to help people find product market fit. That is going to be really, really exciting. I mean, obviously, live selling is somehow going to make it to the West in the next couple of years, and a lot of things like this. But just the website is so overlooked. We will never I think this is sort of an interesting time right now, because everyone, well, not everyone, but I certainly, and maybe some others, are tracking the conversations around Apple and what they allow in the stores, and what they charge for and how much and so on. A lot of this conversation is really, really good, but just remember, the web browser could never be created now. The web browser is one of the most important things that I think has been created. It's one of the most complex pieces of software that has ever been made. It's one of the most amazing pieces of software that's ever been made. And it's the one place that can give you some, where you can stake out territory for yourself. It's the one place on the web that you can own. The one place on the internet that you can own. Almost every other place where anyone can reach you is going to be rented. Now, that's not a bad thing, and often it's super worth it. But you can own your website. You can represent your brand with no middleman, and you can really tell your story. So make use of it. It's also going to outlast probably every other channel, because it's very, very hard to imagine that the web would go fully away. So it's worth the investment. And I just sort of shout out to my 90s internet sensibilities. Yeah.
I mean, those are almost, it almost might sound contradictory. It's like, oh, you want to be on these new platforms, places where everybody isn't, because you're going to be able to take advantage of. When you join Clubhouse right now, it might seem like if you join today to Clubhouse, you might seem like you're late, but you're really so early still.
Yeah.
And on these new platforms, people are so much more generous with their follows, generous with their time versus these mature networks. But that said, on any social app, you are always kind of renting the space, and someone can always change your algorithmic distribution, or what notifications you can send. And so building on a property which is totally unintermediated like the web is just such an important philosophy. I think you guys have done a great job of keeping the web something that's so important in commerce, and it not sort of all having to get buried inside of apps where there's fees and other types of control. So I'm really thankful for you guys for that.
Thanks so much, Josh.
Yes, this is fun. This has been amazing. I would love to do this with you guys again if you're interested. It would be amazing to have you again on, Tobi. And if you guys do want to hear more from Harley, we're actually doing a talk, me and him, just a one-on-one on Friday at 1 p.m. Pacific, to just talk about the sort of his upbringing, his story of going from a t-shirt seller to president of Shopify, and what other people can learn about that journey through entrepreneurship. If you guys want to subscribe to that, if you just tap my little glowing face, either follow me or just hit the little press club button at the bottom. That's my club and the show that I run, and that's where we're going to have Harley on Friday, and we would love to have you as listeners for that. But otherwise, I hope that we get to do more of these, because there's a lot of sort of very casual talks on Clubhouse. There's a lot of really fun ones, but getting vulnerable and getting serious and talking about some of the real challenges that entrepreneurs face, and that it's not all 3 comma clubs and big fundraisers and and announcements in TechCrunch, that it's oftentimes 5 failures before you succeed, or as you guys said, the successful discovery of things that did not work. And so, I'll leave it with Tobi's quote from before, that we are in maybe the opening paragraphs of chapter 2 of a very long book on the topic of commerce. And so it is never too late to get started. So thank you guys so much for joining us. Everybody here in the audience, thank you for helping us break Clubhouse. I guess that's the phrase now. It means a ton to me. And I think it means a ton to these guys to get to share, a more vulnerable message than you might hear on your very professional and honestly, very exciting earnings calls. So thank you guys for joining us today.
Thanks, Josh. This was great. Thanks everyone for joining. It means a lot to us.
If you guys want some of the quotes from this talk, I'm sharing them on my Twitter. It's linked through my Clubhouse. Tobi and Harley have dropped just a ridiculous list of gems, and I've been taking notes this whole time. So if you want some of those, I've got a few of them up on my Twitter right now. But otherwise, I'll play you guys out with an appropriate jam, and otherwise see you, Harley, for our one-on-one Friday 1 p.m. with Press Club. And I'm also running a talk tomorrow night with Justin Kahn, co-founder of Twitch, and a bunch of the top journalists like Mike Isaac from the New York Times, about the launch of Twitter Spaces, their new Clubhouse competitor, Facebook building their own Clubhouse competitor. So if you want to hear the great Clubhouse debate about what's going to happen with Clubhouse versus the big social platforms, join us tomorrow night at 6 p.m. Pacific on Press Club. But otherwise, just deeply thankful for you guys to get so real and so vulnerable, and the sort of the amour between you two, the fact that you guys have both, like you said, fall in love with the same dream, I think is truly inspiring.